Naram-Sin. The Akkadian Empire was the world's first true empire, stretching across Mesopotamia like nothing anyone had ever seen before, and at its peak it was ruled by a man who decided that being the most powerful king on earth simply was not enough. Naram-Sin, who reigned from approximately 2254 to 2218 BC, looked at the thousands of years of Mesopotamian religious tradition around him and made a decision that genuinely shocked the ancient world. He declared himself a living god, not a servant of the gods, not a representative of the gods, but an actual deity walking among men, demanding worship during his own lifetime. He added the divine determinative symbol to his own name in cuneiform script, a marker previously reserved exclusively for gods, and had himself depicted in art wearing the horned helmet that was the unmistakable visual shorthand for divinity in Akkadian iconography. To the people of Mesopotamia, this was not arrogance. It was something closer to cosmic blasphemy. His military campaigns were relentless and brutal, but the act that sealed his reputation for impiety was the sacking of Nippur, one of the most sacred religious centers in all of Mesopotamia, and home to the temple of Enlil, the chief deity of the Sumerian pantheon. Destroying Nippur was the ancient equivalent of burning down the Vatican, and then sending a note saying you did not care. The consequences, according to ancient sources, were devastating. A Sumerian literary text known as the Curse of Akkad, one of the earliest surviving pieces of literature describing divine punishment in human history, blamed Naram-Sin's arrogance and sacrilege for bringing the wrath of the gods down upon his empire in the form of famine, chaos, and invasion by the Guchian people from the Zagros Mountains. For centuries after his death, Babylonian scribes used him as the archetypal impious ruler, the cautionary tale of what happens when a king forgets his place in the cosmic order. The fact that his empire did collapse shortly after his reign only made the moral lesson feel more satisfying to later writers. He was not just evil by ancient standards, he was cosmically stupid, which in the worldview of early Mesopotamia was arguably worse. Akhenaten. If Naram-Sin was the ruler who made himself a god, Akhenaten was the ruler who decided everyone else's gods simply had to go. The 18th dynasty pharaoh of Egypt, who reigned from approximately 1353 to 1336 BC, enacted one of the most radical and destructive religious transformations in the ancient world, abolishing the entire Egyptian pantheon, closing the temples, and installing a single deity, the Aten or sun disk, as the only god permitted in his empire, with himself as the sole human intermediary between the people and that god. To understand how catastrophic this was, you have to understand that Egyptian temples were not just places of worship. They were economic engines, redistributive institutions that employed priests, craftsmen, and workers by the thousands, and fed large portions of the surrounding population through their storehouses. When Akhenaten shut them down and redirected their enormous wealth to his own cult, he did not just offend religious sensibilities. He destabilized the entire economic fabric of Egyptian society. He moved the capital to a brand new city he built from scratch called Akhenaten, known today as Amarna, located in the middle of nowhere, demanding the court uproot itself from established centers of power to follow him into the desert. Meanwhile, Egypt's foreign policy effectively ceased to exist. The Amarna letters, a remarkable cache of clay tablets discovered in 1887, preserved the desperate diplomatic correspondence. From Egyptian vassal states in Canaan and Syria, city rulers pleading for military support as outside enemies closed in around them, writing letter after letter that received no meaningful response because the pharaoh was too busy redesigning religion. Egypt's empire in the Levant crumbled during his reign, partly because he simply could not be bothered to defend it. After his death, his successors, including the young Tutankhamun, reversed virtually everything he had done. His name was chiseled off monuments, his city was abandoned and quarried for stone, and his images were defaced in what historians call damnatio memoriae, the erasure of memory. The fact that it took this much effort to undo one man's reign tells you everything about the scale of the damage he caused. Ashurnasirpal II. Most ancient rulers who committed atrocities at least had the decency to let history discover it. Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire from 883 to 859 BC, was different. He wrote it all down himself, in meticulous detail, in his own royal annals, and had it carved into stone palace reliefs for everyone to see, because in his view, the terror was the point. The annals, which survive today and are housed in institutions including the British Museum, describe his campaigns in language that is almost casual in its brutality. Enemies were flayed alive, their skins stretched and draped over city walls. Prisoners were impaled on wooden stakes planted around the perimeter of conquered cities, visible for miles, a deliberate message to the next city on his list. Children were burned. Captive leaders were mutilated, hands and feet removed, eyes gouged out, before being executed publicly. These were not battlefield decisions made in the heat of combat. They were calculated, organized, and logistically planned acts of terror, applied systematically after victories to ensure that the next city Ashurnasirpal approached would look at what happened to the last one and open its gates rather than resist. In a brutal era, he stood out for the sheer industriousness of his cruelty. He campaigned almost every single year of his reign, grinding through neighboring territories with the relentless consistency of a man who had genuinely turned massacre into administration. Back home in his capital at Nimrud, the ancient city of Kalhu, he constructed a massive palace decorated with stone relief carvings that depicted his campaigns in graphic detail, effectively a permanent monument to organized violence rendered in beautiful craftsmanship. He also hosted a famous banquet to celebrate the palace's completion, reportedly feeding nearly 70,000 guests over 10 days, an event his annals describe with the same careful record-keeping he applied to his killings. The contrast is almost impressive. Ashurnasirpal II built a civilization on top of a foundation of systematic terror, and he wanted absolutely everyone to know it. Cambyses II. Cambyses II inherited the greatest empire on earth from his father Cyrus the Great, and proceeded to make such a spectacular mess of his reign that ancient historians were still shaking their heads about him centuries later. Ruling the Achaemenid Persian Empire from 530 to 522 BC, he began his tenure by having his own brother Smerdis, also known as Bardia, secretly murdered to eliminate a rival claimant to the throne, one of the earliest recorded acts of imperial fratricide in history. His conquest of Egypt in 525 BC was militarily successful, but followed by behavior so erratic that both Egyptian and Greek sources describe him in terms ranging from deeply impious to outright insane. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in Book 3 of his histories, claims that Cambyses stabbed the sacred Apis, bull of Egypt in the thigh, as a deliberate mockery of Egyptian religion. Though some modern Egyptologists reading Egyptian sources like the Apis Stelae tell a somewhat different and more respectful story, so that particular accusation comes with a historical asterisk. What is harder to dispute is that Cambyses executed large numbers of his own officials, advisors, and generals seemingly without consistent justification, creating an atmosphere of paranoid terror in his own court. Two of his military campaigns beyond Egypt ended in catastrophic failure. An expedition toward the oasis of Siwa reportedly ended with an entire army swallowed by a desert sandstorm, somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 men simply vanishing into the Sahara, and a campaign into Ethiopia collapsed from starvation when his forces ran out of food and, according to Herodotus, resorted to cannibalism before retreating. He died in 522 BC under circumstances that remain unclear, possibly from an accidental sword wound to the thigh, which ancient storytellers found satisfyingly ironic given the Apis bull legend. Herodotus is not an unbiased source and had clear reasons to paint Persians unfavorably for a Greek audience, so Cambyses may be partially a literary villain. But even accounting for exaggeration, the collapse of his military ventures and the terror inside his own court point to something that was genuinely going wrong. Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He gave himself the title Epiphanes, meaning God manifest, which tells you most of what you need to know about Antiochus IV's opinion of himself. His subjects, with the dry wit that oppressed people have always deployed, called him Epimanes instead, meaning the mad one, and that nickname survived in the historical record because it was simply too accurate to suppress. Ruling the Seleucid Empire from 175 to 164 BC as a successor to the empire, Alexander the Great had carved across the known world. Antiochus decided that the diverse peoples under his control would be better served by abandoning their cultures and becoming Greek, a project of forced cultural erasure that reached its most violent expression in Judea. He banned Jewish religious practice outright, making observance of the Sabbath, circumcision, and Torah study punishable by death. Then, in 167 BC, he entered the Second Temple in Jerusalem, erected an altar to Zeus inside it, and sacrificed pigs on that altar, an act so deliberately offensive to Jewish religious sensibility that the book of Daniel calls it the abomination of desolation, a phrase that has echoed through Western religious literature for over 2,000 years. The response was not submission. His actions ignited the Maccabean revolt. Jason, one of the first recorded uprisings explicitly fought in the name of religious freedom in human history, and the eventual recapture and rededication of the temple is the event commemorated every year by the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. Antiochus IV is therefore the villain whose cruelty accidentally produced one of of the most celebrated festivals in the world. His campaigns into Egypt were ultimately stopped not by military defeat, but by a single Roman diplomat named Gaius Popilius Laenas, who drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and told him to make his decision before stepping out of it, a legendary act of Roman dominance that humiliated him in front of his own army. He died in 164 BC, reportedly in a state of mental deterioration, while campaigning in Persia. He had managed to offend nearly every group he ever encountered, and left behind a revolt that outlasted him. Caligula started well, which made everything that followed so much worse. When Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, known by the childhood nickname Caligula, meaning Little Boot, assumed power in 37 AD, Romans were so relieved to be free of the paranoid Tiberius that they celebrated in the streets. Then Caligula fell seriously ill early in his reign, and whatever emerged from that illness bore only a passing resemblance to the ruler they had welcomed. According to the historian Suetonius in The 12 Caesars, and Cassius Dio writing decades later, the transformation was dramatic. He declared himself a living god, reportedly held conversations with the statue of Jupiter as an equal, and by some accounts planned to install a statue of himself in the Jerusalem temple, a plan that would have caused a Jewish revolt and was only avoided by delays in his assassination. He executed senators seemingly on impulse, publicly humiliated the Roman elite in ways designed to be maximally degrading, and reportedly forced parents to attend the executions of their own children while maintaining a pleasant expression. The horse consul story, that he made his horse Incitatus a consul, or at least threatened to, is almost certainly exaggerated or satirical, a joke sharpened into legend by hostile sources, but the fact that it is completely believable given everything else says something about how his reign was perceived. Cassius Dio and Suetonius both describe sexual crimes, including assaults on the wives of senators and relationships with his own sisters, though these accounts should be read with awareness that senatorial historians had every reason to destroy his reputation. He was assassinated on January 24th, 41 AD, by members of his own Praetorian Guard, after a reign of less than 4 years. Modern historians debate how much of the Caligula legend is real, and how much is retrospective character assassination by a senatorial class he humiliated and terrorized. The honest answer is probably somewhere in between, and somewhere in between is still genuinely terrifying. Empress Lü. The Han dynasty produced one of history's most chillingly effective power brokers in the form of Empress Lü, the widow of Emperor Gaozu, who became the effective ruler of the Han Empire following her husband's death in 195 BC, and held that power until her own death in 180 BC. She is one of the earliest documented female rulers in Chinese history, which is itself a remarkable fact, and later patriarchal. Historians used the darkness of her methods to argue against female rule for centuries, which is a convenient piece of editorializing that somewhat misses the point that plenty of male rulers were just as vicious. Her most notorious act is recorded by Sima Qian in the Records of the Grand Historian, one of China's foundational historical texts. She's written roughly a century after the events described. Lady Qi had been Emperor Gaozu's favorite concubine, and Empress Lü had spent years watching her husband lavish affection and political attention on arrival. After Gaozu's death removed the only thing protecting Lady Qi, Empress Lü enacted a revenge so methodical it reads less like passion and more like a project plan. She had Lady Qi's hands and feet cut off, her eyes gouged out, her ears destroyed, her tongue removed, and kept her alive in this state, in a place called the House of Darkness, reportedly calling her the human swine. When her own son, Emperor Hui, was brought to see what had been done, he was so psychologically shattered by the sight that he reportedly never recovered, falling into depression and dying young, his mother's act of revenge having effectively destroyed her own heir. Beyond Lady Qi, Empress Lü systematically eliminated Gaozu's sons by other consorts, the potential rivals who might challenge her family's grip on power, forcing suicides and engineering executions with cold administrative efficiency. She consolidated the Han court around her own relatives, reshaping the empire's power structure through a combination of political genius and sustained ruthlessness. The records of the grand historian are written a century after the fact and may carry some embellishment, but the core of her story is broadly accepted by historians as reflecting a real and extraordinarily brutal consolidation of imperial power. Genghis Khan. The numbers associated with Genghis Khan are so large they become difficult to process as referring to human beings. Conservative academic estimates suggest that his campaigns of conquest, conducted from roughly 1206 until his death in 1227, killed approximately 40 million people, a figure representing somewhere around 10% of the entire human population alive at the time. To put that in terms that might land differently, the world's population did not recover the absolute numbers lost during the Mongol conquests for roughly 200 years. He unified the Mongol tribes on the steppe and then turned that unified force outward with the strategic intelligence and organizational sophistication that military historians still study, applying it to the destruction of civilizations across Central Asia, China, Persia, and beyond. The Khwarezmian Empire, which occupied modern Iran, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan, was essentially erased. Cities that had existed for thousands of years, Samarkand, Merv, Nishapur, were destroyed so thoroughly that some never recovered meaningful population levels. Nishapur, reportedly targeted with particular ferocity as revenge for the killing of Genghis' son-in-law, was said by Persian chroniclers to have had its entire population killed and pyramids of skulls constructed from the remains, though those numbers are almost certainly inflated by later writers processing trauma through hyperbole. What is not exaggerated is the destruction of the Khanate irrigation systems, the ancient underground water channels that had sustained Persian agriculture for millennia. Mongol forces systematically destroyed this infrastructure, and some regions of Iran saw farmland turn to desert that has never fully returned to productivity. Iranian population estimates suggest the country lost somewhere between 50 and 75% of its population during the Mongol period, though these figures are contested among historians. Genghis Khan himself framed none of this as cruelty. He believed he was operating under the mandate of Tengri, the eternal sky, sent to punish sinful peoples and bring order to the world. He died in 1227, the exact cause uncertain, with candidates including battle wounds, illness, and a fall from a horse. Whatever killed him, he had already set in motion a transformation of the known world that no individual had matched before or since. Selim I. Selim I took the Ottoman throne in 1512 and began his reign by having all of his brothers and their sons strangled, eliminating every potential rival claimant in a single calculated purge before anyone could organize opposition. This was not unprecedented in Ottoman politics, but Selim systematized it so efficiently that historians credit him with essentially formalizing fratricide as standard Ottoman succession policy. His nickname, earned without apparent irony, was Yavuz, meaning the stern or the grim, and it fit. His campaign against the Safavid Persian Empire culminated in the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, a decisive Ottoman victory, but what followed in Anatolia was arguably worse than the battle itself. Selim ordered the massacre of Anatolian Alevi and Shia Muslim communities, whom he considered Safavid sympathizers and a potential fifth column within his own territory. Estimates of the death toll from these purges range between 40,000 and 70,000 people, with the numbers varying depending on the source, and the methodology used to count victims across a dispersed population. The conquest of the Mamluk Sultanate in 1517 brought Egypt, Syria, and the Hejaz, including Mecca and Medina, under Ottoman control, and Selim marked the occasion by executing the last Mamluk Sultan, Tumen Bey, at the gates of Cairo by hanging, a process reportedly made more protracted by the rope breaking twice before the execution was completed on the third attempt. His Grand Viziers, the men who served as his chief administrators, were so aware of how precarious their position was that serving as Selim's vizier was considered functionally a delayed death sentence. He executed at least 7 Grand Viziers during his 8 years of rule, a rate of attrition that made recruitment for the position something of a challenge. The remarkable thing about Selim, historically, is that despite all of this, he doubled the size of the Ottoman Empire in 8 years, an expansion no subsequent sultan matched. He died of illness in 1520, possibly plague or cancer, having transformed the empire more thoroughly in less than a decade than most rulers manage in a lifetime. Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb's path to the Mughal throne began with imprisoning his own father and ended with executing his brothers, which established clearly what kind of reign was coming. Emperor Shah Jahan, the man who built the Taj Mahal as a monument to love, spent the last 8 years of his life confined in Agra Fort, dying there in 1666, able to see the Taj Mahal from his window, but not reach it. His son Dara Shikoh, the liberal crown prince who had been groomed for succession and who favored religious tolerance and philosophical synthesis between Islam and Hinduism, was captured, paraded through Delhi in rags on a filthy elephant to maximize his humiliation, and then publicly beheaded. Aurangzeb then reversed nearly a century of Mughal religious policy established by Akbar the Great, reimposing the jizya tax on non-Muslim subjects that Akbar had abolished, ordering the destruction of Hindu temples and Sikh gurdwaras, and making the empire's religious character dramatically more exclusionary. The execution of Guru Tegh Bahadur, the 9th Sikh Guru, on November 11th, 1675, in Delhi, carried out because the Guru refused to convert to Islam, is one of the defining events in Sikh history. Rather Rather than crushing resistance, it galvanized the Sikh community, leading directly to the militarization of Sikhism under the 10th Guru, Gobind Singh, and transforming the Sikhs into a fighting force that would eventually help bring down Mughal power. The Maratha leader Shivaji, Aurangzeb's most famous opponent, spent decades fighting him in the Deccan Plateau, and became a symbol of Hindu resistance that is invoked in Indian politics to this day. Aurangzeb's nearly 50-year reign, the longest of any Mughal emperor, was spent increasingly bogged down in the Deccan campaigns that drained the empire's treasury and manpower. He died in 1707 at approximately 88 years old, still in the field, and the empire he left behind was too exhausted and fractured to survive another generation intact. Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV of Russia, earned his epithet, though the Russian word Grozny, usually translated as terrible, actually carries the meaning of formidable or fearsome, rather than simply evil, a distinction his defenders sometimes raise, and his victims would probably find irrelevant. He ruled from 1547 to 1584, and for much of that reign was a capable, even impressive administrator. Then in 1565 he created the Oprichnina, a personal parallel state within Russia with its own territory, its own laws, and its own enforcers, the Oprichniki, a personal secret police force that operated entirely outside normal legal constraints. The Oprichniki dressed in black, rode black horses, and carried severed dog heads and brooms attached to their saddles as symbols of their function, to sniff out and sweep away treason. What they actually did was terrorize the Russian nobility for 7 years, executing, torturing, and dispossessing anyone Ivan suspected of disloyalty, with suspicion being a remarkably flexible standard. The massacre of Novgorod in 1570 is the single worst documented atrocity of his reign. Ivan became convinced the city was conspiring to defect to Lithuania, and sent the Oprichniki in for 5 weeks of systematic killing. Death toll estimates range from a few thousand to 60,000 people, with the truth almost certainly somewhere in the lower to middle part of that range. But even the conservative estimates represent a deliberate campaign of mass killing against a civilian population. In 1581, in a fit of rage during an argument, Ivan struck his own son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, on the head with his iron-tipped staff, killing him. The killing of his designated successor destabilized the Russian state's future so completely that it contributed to the catastrophic period known as the Time of Troubles following Ivan's own death in 1584. Ivan himself seemed to be aware of the horror of what he had done across his reign. He compiled long lists of people he had ordered killed and sent them to monasteries with instructions to pray for their souls, a kind of religious accounting that suggests genuine psychological conflict rather than simple sociopathy. Centuries later, Joseph Stalin would explicitly cite Ivan the Terrible as an admirable historical figure, which tells you something about both of them. Viceroy Francisco de Toledo. The Silver Mountain of Potosi in modern Bolivia sits at over 4,000 meters above sea level, and in the 16th century it was the most productive silver mine in the world, producing wealth that literally reshaped global economies, inflated European currencies, and funded Spanish imperial dominance for a century. The man who built the system that extracted that wealth was Francisco de Toledo, Viceroy of Peru from 1569 to 1581, and the system he built was the Mida, a forced labor arrangement that conscripted indigenous men to work in the mines under conditions that were, without exaggeration, designed around the premise that the workers were replaceable. The mines were dark, the air inside full of toxic dust that destroyed lungs within years, the hours brutal, the pay inadequate, and the descent into the shafts on ropes and wooden ladders so dangerous that workers reportedly said prayers before going down as if preparing for death. The mountain was nicknamed the mountain that eats men, which is exactly the kind of nickname that develops when people are dying in large enough numbers to require an organizing metaphor. Toledo formalized the Moiety by adapting an existing Inca labor system and scaling it into something far more lethal, creating administrative machinery that would continue extracting lives from indigenous communities long after his own tenure ended. He also ordered the execution of Tupac Amaru I, the last Inca emperor, on September 24, 1572, in the main plaza of Cuzco, over the explicit objections of local Catholic clergy, who argued the emperor had not been given adequate time to convert and receive religious preparation. When Toledo returned to Spain, expecting recognition for having consolidated Peru so thoroughly, King Philip II reportedly dismissed him coldly, telling him he had been sent to serve kings, not kill them, a rebuke that suggests even the Spanish crown found the execution of the Inca ruler in excess. Toledo died in Spain, in obscurity, having built a machine of colonial extraction, whose full death toll accumulated across generations. Leopold II. Leopold II of Belgium never once visited the Congo. He managed the deaths of millions of people from his palaces in Brussels, presenting himself to European society as a philanthropist and humanitarian, while running the Congo Free State, which he personally owned as a private colony from 1885 to 1908, as a rubber extraction operation of extraordinary brutality. The mechanism was the quota system. Villages were assigned rubber collection quotas, and failure to meet those quotas was punished by the Force Publique, Leopold's colonial militia. The soldiers of the Force Publique were required to produce severed human hands, as proof that bullets issued to them had been used on human targets rather than wasted on hunting. This created a perverse incentive structure in which hands became a kind of currency, collected in baskets, sometimes smoked to preserve them, sometimes cut from living people when soldiers wanted to account for ammunition without expending it in actual combat. Photographs of Congolese people displaying amputated stumps, where hands had been exist in historical archives, making this one of the best documented atrocity systems of the colonial era. Estimates of the total death toll during Leopold's personal rule range from 1 million to 10 million Congolese people, a range that reflects genuine historical uncertainty about population, counts in a region where records were controlled by the perpetrators. The exposure came through the work of shipping clerk turned journalist E.D. Morel, who noticed that ships returning from the Congo carried rubber and ivory but no trade goods, only weapons and ammunition, and concluded that the Congolese were not trading but being coerced. Diplomat Roger Casement's 1904 report to the British. Government documented the atrocities in systematic detail and triggered an international campaign that eventually forced Belgium to strip Leopold of his personal colony in 1908. Leopold died in 1909, 1 year later, having used the fortune extracted from the Congo to build parks, public buildings, and monuments across Belgium. The country is still debating what to do with them. Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler's rise to power was not a sudden coup by a lone madman, but a process that unfolded in full view of a democratic society, moving from failed putsch in 1923 to chancellor on January 30th, 1933, to absolute Führer by August 2nd, 1934, through elections, legal mechanisms, and the willing collaboration of institutions that should have stopped him. The ideology he brought to power was not improvised. It was a coherent, long-developed worldview built from racial pseudoscience, social Darwinism, and a specific and deeply distorted reading of German nationalist history, elaborated in Mein Kampf and refined over years of political organizing. The Holocaust, the systematic state-sponsored murder of approximately 6 million Jewish people along with Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, gay men, and others, implemented through a bureaucratic apparatus formalized at the Wannsee Conference on January 20th, 1942, represents an atrocity so documented, so deliberate, and so industrially organized that it set a new reference point for what human beings are capable of doing to each other. The total dead in the Holocaust across all targeted groups reached between 11 and 17 million people, depending on what categories are included in the count. World War II, which began directly from Hitler's expansionist aggression, produced an estimated 70 to 85 million deaths, when all military casualties and civilian deaths from famine, disease, and killing operations are included, making it the deadliest conflict in recorded human history. What makes Hitler particularly important to understand, beyond the sheer scale of the death he caused, is that he maintained genuine popular support in Germany well into the war, sustained by propaganda, the economic recovery of the 1930s, and the psychological pull of nationalism, demonstrating that mass atrocity does not require a population of monsters, only a population that has been given sufficient incentive to look away. He died by suicide on April 30th, 1945, in a Berlin bunker as Soviet forces entered the city, avoiding the accountability of a trial, and leaving behind a mythology that has proven disturbingly durable. Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin died in his bed on March 5, 1953, which is, when you consider the evidence of his reign, one of history's more remarkable facts. He ruled the Soviet Union from the mid-1920s until his death, consolidating absolute power through a combination of political maneuvering, institutional capture, and eventually the application of terror so comprehensive that even being his close ally provided no meaningful safety. The Great Purge of 1936 to 1938 is the most concentrated expression of his paranoid power. During those 2 years, approximately 750,000 people were executed by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, and millions more were arrested and sent into the Gulag system, the vast network network of forced labor camps stretching across Siberia and the Soviet periphery that the writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn documented in the Gulag Archipelago, published in 1973. The purge consumed the Communist Party itself, the military officer corps, the intelligentsia, and eventually ordinary citizens denounced by neighbors settling personal scores within a system that rewarded denunciation and punished skepticism. The Holodomor, the engineered famine of 1932 to 1933 in Ukraine, killed an estimated 3.5 to 7.5 million Ukrainians through the deliberate enforcement of grain quotas during a famine. State agents, going from house to house confiscating food from people who were already starving, a policy so targeted in its application to Ukraine that many historians in more than 30 governments now classify it as genocide. Stalin's total attributable death toll across collectivization, the Gulag, the purges, and the famines is estimated by scholars at somewhere between 6 million and 20 million, a range that reflects the genuine difficulty of attributing deaths in a system where records were controlled by perpetrators and the causes of death were routinely falsified. Unlike Hitler, Stalin was on the winning side of World War II, which insulated him from the immediate judgment of history and allowed the Soviet state to suppress information about his crimes for decades. It was not until Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech on February 25, 1956, delivered to a closed session of the Communist Party 3 years after Stalin's death, that the crimes were acknowledged internally, and even then the full reckoning took another generation. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.